All right, so today we're going to be looking at abundance. Let's review very quickly how did we get here. We established that there were about 4.6 billion years ago when the planet came to be. 100 million years later, the moon was formed. A billion years passed by and nothing is happening in this planet other than maybe what is called a protocell, which is just like a plastic bag that allows to contain molecules that allows complex processes to emerge that led to what is called the prokaryotes, which are organisms that don't have a nucleus, mostly bacteria and archaea. And then from those we move to more complex forms like the eukaryotes, and moving forward to today, which are the planet with 8.7, 8.9 million species. We established as well that in the process of origination of new species, which can happen in four potential ways, the species occupy certain areas, and those areas are called geographical ranges. Many species doing that simultaneously leads to what is called parents in species richness. Once the species get to those places, interact with other species and their environment, they start changing attributes of the species, and we in the last class saw how that could influence body size. And today we're going to be looking at how those interactions among species with their environment can also influence abundance. So let's start by first thinking about what are the factors at the most basic level that will influence the size of a population. Keep in mind that a population is a group of individuals of the same species. So what are the factors that determine why certain species have the abundances that they do? You think about whales, why there are so fewer whales than there are individuals of ants. So at the most basic level, the size of a population can be reduced to two factors: the input and the output. And it's the balance between the inputs and the outputs that determine at the end how many individuals you ended up having in that population. The demographic factors that influence the input are natality and immigration. Basically, in the input is what is adding individuals to a population. The most basic level is how many individuals are being born and how many individuals come from somewhere else, what is called immigration. Now, on the output, you have two demographic factors. One is mortality and the other one is immigration, right? Mortality is how many individuals die, and that obviously is taking individuals out of the population. And immigration is basically taking individuals out by the individuals moving somewhere else. It's the balance between those four demographic factors, natality and immigration, and mortality and immigration, that determine at the most basic level the size of a given population. So mathematically, that can be defined in numerous ways, and the earliest attempts to quantify the size of the population is what is called density independent growth. As the term implies, it's basically a growth of a population that is independent on how many individuals are there to begin with. That's what is called so here, let me explain the mathematical equation. So again, you look at the factors that I outlined before. So you have natality plus immigration. Again, these are inputs, and that's the reason why they are added, minus mortality minus immigration. And they are negative because they are subtracting. And it's the balance between those four factors, what is called the population growth rate. Mathematically, at times that's indicated as a fraction or as a percentage. So here, you get a sense of the growth rate again as a proportion or as a fraction. You can easily then calculate the size of the population using this equation. It's pretty simple. Basically, what you have here is the population size. Mathematically, that's commonly defined with the capital letter N at a time t plus 1. Okay, so that t plus 1 normally indicates a generation or year, who knows, depending on the study that you had at hand. The way to read that is the size of the population at time t plus 1 is equal to the size of the population at the current time plus the size of the population at the current time times the growth rate, right? So let's say quickly, for instance, that the growth rate is 10% and the size of the population is 10. So that means that at the population t plus 1 is going to be 100, which is the population size right now, plus 100 times 0.1 or 10%, that's 10, that means that the size of the population at a time t plus 1 is going to be 110 for a population that is growing at a 10%. Mathematically, the growth rate is exemplified here on these equations, and again, it's the same exercise that I just did before. Here I had different populations, 3 populations, 1, 2, and 3, growing at a rate of 10%, 20%, and 30%, and at different time scales, right? And basically all what I do is for every time step, I recalculate the population at a given time based on the growth rate, and then I obtain these plots here. So here you can see, for instance, the size of the population over time when the growth rate is 10%, 20%, and 30%. As you can see from these trends increase exponentially, and they are called what is called density independent growth, because here you see the size of the population here, there is no controls to it. The size of the population is growing as a simple function of the growth rate. There is nothing controlling the population. In nature, however, that's unrealistic. There are things that control the size of the populations in nature, and many times they are actually dependent on how many individuals are there. And that then led to what is called density dependent growth, in which now the size of the population is going to be controlled based on how many individuals are there in the population. That is also called logistic model or Lotka-Volterra model. Lotka and Volterra are two mathematicians that independently came out with the same mathematical model to predict the size of the populations. So what they did, which is pretty simple but still pretty clever, was to use exactly the same mathematical equation that we just used, which is density independent, again the population size being a function of the current population times the growth rate, but they added something to that, what is called a carrying capacity. And that carrying capacity is identified with the letter K, and the way to model that mathematically is 1 minus the size of the population at the current time divided by K. So let's just make a quick example for you to realize that this is actually not that complicated. So here you have the size of the population at the current time. The following thing that we have to do is to find out how many individuals more are going to be added to for the next time. Basically what it is the current number of individuals times the growth rate times 1. So let's imagine that the current capacity is 100, right? And the current size of the population is 100. So 100 here divided by 100, that gives you 1. 1 minus 1 gives you 0. Basically, as a result, all of these terms become 0. So the size of the population at a time t plus 1 is going to be equal to exactly this current size. The size is not going to grow because the current capacity is already at the top of, because the current size of the population is already at current capacity. This term here, mathematically, is what is called density dependence ratio, and again is a whole mathematical equation that was introduced by those two guys back in the day. Now here you can see a population like the ones that I just simulated before, growing at a rate of 0.3, 30% per generation. But here what I did, I simulated these populations here having different carrying capacities. So in this case, I had carrying capacity of 50, and you can see how the population stabilizes at 50. Here I have carrying capacity of 100, and the population stabilizes at 100, 150, and the population stabilizes at 150. So this effect of the carrying capacity, again, all what it does is to control the size of the population as the population start reaching the carrying capacity. Here, just for you to realize the contrast on the growth rate that is density independent at 30%. So in red here, this is what you will expect of the population growing at a rate of 30% per generation. But what will happen here when you have different carrying capacities imposed upon that population? Basically, it just narrows down how many individuals are added to the given population. Now, the next thing that you have to then figure out is what is controlling the carrying capacity of a population, right? What factors do control how many individuals can be held on a given place? So one potential factor is competition, and competition can also be modeled mathematically. Basically, what you do here is to recalculate this mathematical equation by basically accounting for the abundance of the other species that you are competing with. Another thing about competition and population size that I should mention right away is what is called the principle of competitive exclusion. So it was an idea introduced back in the day by this guy called Harding, which is the idea that when a species compete and one species gains a competitive advantage over the other, as small as it can be over time, it could become significant to the point that one species, that one that dominates, is gonna drive the other species to extinction. That's what is called the principle of competitive exclusion. And it was proved here with these paramations, and you can see how the populations of these two species, when they are separated in separated cultures, they stabilize at the current capacity of wherever they are being grown. But when they are put together, one species, the one that you can see here in red, becoming more abundant than the one in blue, you can see that the one in red, when they are combined, becomes dominant, and it drives the species in blue to extinction. That's what is called the principle of competitive exclusion. And the idea behind this is that a species that compete for the same resource, once a given species gains an advantage, is going to drive the other species to extinction. This has been challenged quite a lot in nature. While it works very well in experiments, in nature this hasn't been proven. The reason being that in nature there are many heterogeneities in habitat and climate that allows a species to specialize to resources such that they can both live in the same place while still managing to survive. And again, that's what is called niche specialization. And all what it is a species adapting to different uses or resources such that they reduce the area in which they overlap in competition with other species. We explained that also before. Another factor that controls the size of the population is predation. Obviously, you are getting eaten by a predator, your numbers are going to increase quite dramatically. That's if you are the prey. If you are the predator, obviously the prey reduces, then you are not going to have enough energy to produce offspring. So the predator might also decline as well, the prey, depending on the oscillations of the prey. Has been found, though, mathematically it can be modeled as well. I don't want to get us into too much detail about the mathematics on this, but what I want you to realize or to know from this class, though, is that there is commonly oscillation patterns that are alternative between the population size of the prey and the population size of the predator. So they tend to oscillate quite a lot. So when the predator, for instance, increases in abundance, the prey is going to decline. There is going to be a point when the prey declines so much that there is not enough food to sustain all of the predators, so the predators are going to decline. When the predators decline, then the prey had a release and they are going to increase their abundances, and that creates again this oscillation that is alternative between the abundances of the predators and the prey. Now, those are what are called density dependent controls, the ones that we just look at, like competition and predation. However, there are other controls on the population that are independent of the density. Basically, what we are talking about here is factors that influence how many individuals you get in a population regardless of how many individuals are there. And those are normally factors like, for instance, environmental tolerances. You can imagine, for instance, temperature, right? Temperature doesn't really care if you have few or a lot of individuals on a given place. That's the reason why it's called density independent factor, because it has an effect on the population that is independent on how many individuals are there. Here is an example for instance, the effect on temperature on the population. There is always going to be optimum conditions where you get the highest density of individuals. When it gets too hot, the density declines, and when it gets too cold, the density declines as well. And here is an example of a variable that is density independent. Again, it's going to influence the size of the population independent of how many individuals are there. Now, another set of factors that influence the size of the population is the dispersal capacity of the species and the quality and availability of habitats. Let me just explain to you. So early on, we talk about there being factors like immigration, natality, migration, and mortality that influence the size of the population. Two factors that are important here are immigration and emigration, right? What that means then is that the populations are going to be interconnected by what is called dispersal. So, and that led to what is called a metapopulation. Metapopulation is patches of populations that are connected by dispersal. So it's the same population that we were talking about earlier, but now we are assuming that there are many similar populations everywhere, and all of those populations are connected by dispersal. In that case, you are going to be referring to what is called a metapopulation. And again, are ensemble of patches that are interconnected by dispersal. In that case, there are several factors that become important to maintain a metapopulation. One of them is the isolation of those patches. Obviously, if the patches are too far apart, there are going to be fewer individuals capable of moving from one patch to another one, and you can imagine how that's going to influence the population size on those patches. The other one is going to be the patch size. Obviously, larger patches had a capacity to hold more individuals than patches that are small. The other third attribute is the quality of the patch. So if obviously you had patches with good environmental conditions, you are potentially going to have more individuals than patches in which the conditions are unsuitable. So those are three key attributes as they relate to the habitat that are important for a metapopulation. This is an example here of this guy Hill on a paper that he did on Journal of American Animal Ecology in butterflies. So now with that being said, it turns out that there are several rules about how habitat influences the size of a population. The first rule is that the larger the patch, the larger the population. The larger the patch, the larger the rate of immigration. So I want you to think about this rule here. Again, if the patch is larger, there is a higher chance of you migrating. And the best example that I have for this is this. Back in the day, maybe 25 years ago, I was invited to Hawaii when I was an undergrad in Colombia, and I came over here. And when we were going back, after I realized that it was a very long flight, in that flight, the captain, 2 hours into this flight, the captain said, we had a navigation problem, and we had to go back to Hawaii. I am not joking. I grabbed myself from that chair. I was about to scream, and I was just waiting for somebody else to scream for me to start screaming as well, because that idea just terrified me. What terrified me even more was the idea that the captain decided to turn himself back. My reasoning was that if the navigation system is wrong, why are you gonna turn back trying to find Hawaii, which is a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, when you can just keep going straight? And eventually, if the navigation system is completely grown, eventually you are going to be able to hit the continent, given the fact that it's a much larger space. So it's kind of the same reasoning here. Ecologically, if you had an area that is particularly large, you had a much higher chance of individuals that are moving around, even if they're moving randomly, to get to that place. If the patch is small, then you have a much smaller chance of anything getting there. So this is a very important rule as it relates to the impact of habitat on metapopulations, which is that the size of the patch determines the rate of immigration or immigration to that place. Now, obviously, this one is another rule that kind of makes sense. The smaller the isolation, the larger the input of new individuals. So obviously, if you had patches that are closer to each other, there's a higher chance that individuals might cross. If the patches are too far apart, then you have fewer individuals going from one patch to the other one. And this one is another rule that will make a lot of sense, that suggests that if the patch has a good quality of resources there, then you might have a more abundant populations or more resilient populations on those places. There is evidence for these rules everywhere. So here is just some examples that I point out to you of different papers that kind of support these different rules. And again, they are generally well-established rules as they relate to the characteristics of the habitat influencing the size of metapopulations. Let's summarize the class up to now. We already established that the size of the population is regulated by the input and output of individuals. In the input, we had immigration and natality. In the output, we had immigration and mortality. We also established that this immigration and emigration leads to what is called metapopulations. We also established that these factors that influence the size of the population locally could be related to ecological interactions like predation, competition, mutualism, etc. And as it relates to the size of the metapopulation, there are also important things like the size of the patch, the isolation of the patch, and the quality of the patch. And we established as well that there are several environmental constraints, mostly density independent variables that also play a role into the size of the population. So that summarizes what are some of the drivers, some of the factors that influence the abundances of a species. Now let's look at some of the patterns that have been observed in abundance across species. So the first pattern that has been observed in nature is what is called the abundance frequency distribution. So these plots here, normally they are referred as frequency distributions, and all what it is just basically a frequency of a species as a function of a given attribute. So here you can have body mass, range size, or abundance. If it is abundance, it's going to call abundance frequency distributions. If it is range size, it's going to be called the range size frequency distributions. If it is body size, it's going to be called body size frequency distributions. And again, all what it is just a plot that describes the frequency of a species here on the y-axis as a function of different attributes that are measured there on the x-axis. So going back again to one of the main patterns on abundance is what is called the species abundance frequency distribution. And what it shows is that in most communities, if you were to go any community in the world and sample all of the species that are there, the abundances, what you find is that most of the species are rare, while very few species are very abundant, right? So again, the general pattern here on the species abundance frequency distribution, keep in mind that you can play around with those terms, move them back and forth. As far as they contain the same words, they mean the same. And the idea here is that in most communities, most species are rare, and that causes, again, for you to have a lot of species. Here in this case, there are more than 110 species with only one individual on this community in the River Thames, in which they sample species of beetles. The question is why? That's another interesting pattern. That's the pattern. Now let's look at the process. Why is it that most species are rare? So there are several hypotheses that have been proposed for this. One is what is called niche partitioning. It was introduced by Robert MacArthur back in the day. This is a very famous guy in ecology. The idea of Robert MacArthur is this. So imagine that you had a resource that is outlined here in this blue line, and once you get two species using that resource, we explain as a result of a niche specialization, those two species are going to specialize in the use of certain resource. So they partition the use of the resource. They're the idea of niche partitioning. Now, when a third species arrive, it has to interact with one of the species. So it's going to partition the resource with one of the other species that was already established there. And anytime that a new species arrive, it's going to start partitioning the resources with species that are already adapted to that resource. And that leads to what is called the niche partitioning idea. And as you can see from this example here, you had a species that are, few of them had the capacity of use a lot of resources, and that's going to make them, few of them with that capacity to use resources, they are going to be very abundant, but they're going to be very few, while species that use fewer resources are going to become more and more abundant. And that explains why is it that you get on a given community most species being rare. It's because once they get to that place, they had to compete with species that already specialized there, and basically there is no much resources for them to be using, and as a result, those species become rare and rare and rare. And again, the general idea of the niche partitioning introduced by MacArthur is basically that there is a subsequential subdivision of resources that cause progressively smaller populations. There is another idea to explain why that distribution is skewed, and it's called neutral theory. Neutral theory has basically two assumptions to it. One is that local communities are saturated with individuals. Basically, what it means here is that if you go anywhere in the world and you look at a place, the habitat that you see there is completely saturated with individuals. There is no space that is not being used, and there's the idea that they are saturated with individuals. So that's the assumption number one of the neutral theory. The second assumption of the neutral theory is that most species disperse very short distances, while there are very few species capable of dispersing long distances. Basically, what you ended up having is what is called a kernel distribution. Basically, what it means here is that this is the frequency of individuals and this is the distance. For most species will disperse very close to home. I'm talking about individuals here. most individuals will disperse will stay close to home, while few individuals will manage to move farther away. This is what is called a kernel distribution, and they are normally skewed to the left. The idea here again is that if you look at a given species, most of the individuals will stay close to home, very few of them will move farther apart. Based on these two assumptions, there was several guys, one of them called Bill, that explained the distribution of abundances being skewed based on this simple notion. You think about this, let's break it down into how can this neutral theory then explain why most species are rare. The idea here is that if you by any chance lose an individual from a given place, let's say that it just died, who is most likely to occupy that habitat, right? Now, if you look at this frequency distribution here, what happens then is that the species that are more abundant locally are going to produce a lot more offspring that are going to stay closer to home. So basically what it suggests is that those species that are already common on a given place are the ones that are most likely to occupy habitats that become empty. The consequence of this is that species that are common become even more common, right? And the species that are rare will become even more rare. And that is an explanation that has been suggested to explain the frequency distribution of abundances being left skewed, basically showing that most of the individuals on a given population are rare. Another pattern in abundance is basically the relationship between abundance and range size. What it has been found though is that species that have large geographical ranges normally have larger local densities as well. So here is an example. This is a paper that was published by Kevin Gaston. Here you have multiple species and you can see the geographical range size of these species, whatever he was studying here, against their density. And what you can see is that generally speaking, there is a direct relationship here. Basically, species that have large geographical ranges normally have also larger densities. There are multiple explanations that Kevin Gaston has proposed to explain this. The first one is basically the idea that species that are abundant obviously had to use more space, and the use alone of that larger space will force the species to be present in a larger geographical range. The second explanation is that obviously, if a species is locally abundant, it means that it has a broader niche. It has a capacity to use resources over broader ranges, and those same attributes then allows that same species to be found in many other places, given that those same resources might be just as diverse in other places. There is also neutral explanations for this relationship, and basically what the idea here is that locally abundant species had higher probability to disperse far away from occupied places and then increase their range size. Again, the idea is if you are locally abundant and you're gonna have producing a lot of offsprings, by chance alone, that is gonna lead to a few individuals reaching farther away places, and that then causes for you to have a large geographical range when you have large abundances. And the second explanation related to neutral theory is that highly dispersing species can maintain high local abundances over large geographical areas. Again, if you are dispersing a lot, and obviously that means that you're going to have local abundances that are large because of that migration is enhanced, but at the same time, it will lead you to potentially having a larger geographical range. Another relationship that should be obvious by right now is the relationship between abundance and body size. Basically, what it has been found is that species that have large body size are less abundant than species with a smaller body size. If you think about this, it's like pretty obvious, I think, for you thinking about whales. Whales are pretty rare, right? Because they are huge and there are not that many individuals in comparison to things like ants, right? They are small and they are super abundant. But here is a pattern though, the actual pattern between abundance and body size, and this is a paper that was published back in the day by Damon in 1981, and he shows here the relationship between body size and abundance of tens of species, and you can see what I just described to you. In general, in nature, species that have large body sizes will have smaller abundances. Species that have smaller body sizes tend to commonly have larger abundances. This led to what is called an energetic equivalence rule. It's a concept introduced by a guy called Brown. And the idea here is that there is just so much energy that comes from the sun that gotta be converted into biomass, and a species had a choice between the trading off this energy between either a larger body size or a smaller, larger body size or smaller abundances, right? So again, the strength of this relationship between body size and abundance seems to be the result of an energetic equivalence rule, basically suggesting that the amount of energy that comes from the sun is allocated by a species by either having larger abundances and smaller body sizes, or choosing to have larger body sizes but smaller abundances. And that's what is called an energy equivalence rule. You cannot have both ways, right? Just bypass this slide here. So as every single class that we have studied so far, we have always finished up those lectures by asking, why are those attributes important? So let's ask the same question here. Why is studying abundance important? So the importance here, of course, is that abundance is related to extinction risk. Obviously, it makes sense that extinction by itself is the definition of abundance getting to zero. But there are multiple case examples that have been demonstrating that in historical and current times, the decline in abundances is a good indicator of the species increasing the risk of going extinct. This is, for instance, a paper published by Payne back in 2011. And here what he did, he looked at the historical record and analyzed the extent in which the species that went extinct, whether they were rare or abundant. And he created this ratio here. I don't really want to get into the specific on this, but basically if you are above zero, that means that the rare species had a greater risk of extinction. If you are below zero, that means that the rare species had a lower risk of going extinct. When you go through the paleontological record, what you find is that over time, regardless of the time period that he analyzed there, most of the species that went extinct were species that were rare. He put the frequency distribution on here, and you can see that, generally speaking, if there is any evidence in the past to indicate the risk of a species going extinct, it suggests that most of the species that had gone extinct are species that have been rare in the past. And that obviously poses a major concern today when we look at what is happening to the species in the planet. This is, for instance, a report done by the WWF back in the day, and they analyzed the abundances of all of the species in the world for which there is a good time record. And they analyzed, I believe, over 3,000 populations that were monitored between 1970 and 2000. And what they found is that of all of these populations for which there is data, there is an average decline of 40%. Here are the actual trends, again, from 1970 to 2000. And you can see how terrestrial species are declining, marine species are declining, freshwater species are declining. When you analyze all of the species together, they are declining. So there is this general trend of an incredible number of species declining, which is kind of concerning given what Payne just showed, that the species that go extinct more commonly are species that are rare. So here what we are doing is making species more rare and rare over time. Let's summarize the class. When you look at the population size, how many individuals are there on a given population, you know that the size of that population is regulated by the inputs, that is natality or recruitment, immigration, which is how many individuals get to that population. On the outputs, we have mortality and emigration. We know that things related to natality and mortality could be ecological factors that we talk about, like competition and predation, and density independent factors like environmental tolerances, like temperature, habitat quality, etc. Factors that regulate immigration and emigration, we talk about things like the size, isolation, and the quality of those habitats. As for the patterns in abundance, we talk about the abundance frequency distribution. Basically, most species in the planet at any given community are rare. We established that there are different ways to explain these patterns related to the niche theory or the neutral theory. Niche theory being what MacArthur proposed, neutral theory suggesting this idea by Graham Bell, that the populations this species being rare can be explained by simple fact that all of the habitats are saturated and that most of the species disperse close distances. The other pattern that you will find as it relates to abundance is that the larger the abundance, the broader the geographical distribution. We also explain how niche and neutral theory could explain this. And finally, the larger the abundance, the larger the body size. And we explained that this could be related again to how a species allocate the use of resources, energy that comes from the sun, and how they spread out that according to the energy equivalence rule. That summarizes the class for today. See you guys in the next episode.